A nurse treats a wounded Mafia boss. Hours later, he orders his men, find her immediately. The hospital never really slept. It only got quieter. At 11:47 on a Wednesday night, Sofia Reyes was standing at the nurse's station on the third floor, writing notes on a patient file, when she heard the ambulance bay doors open below. She did not look up at first. Doors opened and closed all night long in this place. It was the sound that followed, or rather, the absence of the usual sounds, that made her pause. No paramedics calling out vitals. No rolling stretcher wheels. Just heavy footsteps, fast and purposeful, and then someone on the floor below saying, in a voice that was very calm and very serious, "Get the nurse. Now." Sofia was already moving before the words fully reached her. She took the stairs, not the elevator. When she pushed through the trauma bay doors, she stopped for just 1 second, not from fear, but to take in the scene quickly, the way she had trained herself to do. 2 large men stood near the wall. They were dressed well, both of them, and they were watching the room with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with worry for a friend. In the middle of the room, on the gurney, was a third man. He was older than the other 2, somewhere in his mid-40s, with dark gray at his temples and a face that was angular and sharp. His suit, which had clearly been expensive, was torn on the left side and soaked through with red. He had 2 wounds in his flank. He was losing blood. And he was awake. His eyes were open, and the first thing they did was find her. Sofia moved to his side without hesitating. She checked his pulse, stronger than she expected, and started assessing the wounds while she called over her shoulder for Dr. Okonkwo. One of the men by the wall stepped forward and said, quietly, that there would be no police report tonight. Sofia did not answer him right away. She pressed a folded cloth against the deeper wound and looked at the man on the gurney. He was watching her with dark, steady eyes. Not panicked. Not pleading. Just watching, the way someone watches who is deciding whether to trust you with something important. "What's your name?" she asked him. He said nothing. She asked again. He finally said, "Marco." Nothing else. Just the one word, spoken as if that was already more than he usually gave. Dr. Okonkwo arrived 3 minutes later and the 2 of them worked quickly and without unnecessary conversation. Sofia had been a nurse for 6 years, and she had learned early that the trauma bay was no place for slow hands or scattered thoughts. She did what needed to be done. She focused entirely on the wounds, on the vitals, on the 4 lines she set with practiced ease. But somewhere at the back of her mind, a quieter part of her was noticing things. The 2 men by the wall never looked at Marco with softness, only with alertness. The phone that appeared from inside one man's jacket and disappeared just as quickly. The way nobody in this room had provided a single piece of paperwork. She had seen frightened families. She had seen grieving ones. These men were neither. They were employees. Very serious, very capable employees. Marco lost consciousness twice during the procedure and came back both times on his own, without drama, as though losing and regaining awareness was simply something his body managed the way other bodies managed breathing. The second time he surfaced, he was calmer. He lay still and let Sofia work. At one point, when Dr. Okonkwo stepped out briefly, Marco turned his head and looked at her and said, in a low and even voice, "You're not afraid of me." It was not a compliment. It was not a taunt. It sounded more like an observation that surprised him slightly. Sofia pressed a clean cloth to his side without looking up. "I'm afraid of you losing too much blood," she said. "That's enough to worry about right now." He said nothing. But she felt his eyes stay on her face for a long moment before he looked away. By 2 in the morning he was stable. They moved him to a private room on the far end of the corridor, away from the other patients, and his men arranged themselves in the hallway with a quiet efficiency that made the night staff walk past quickly and say very little. Sofia checked on her other patients. She refilled a chart. She drank half a cup of cold coffee. Then, because it was her job and she would not let anything change the way she did her job, she went back to check his dressings. She expected to find him sleeping. He was sitting up, the force still running into his arm, reading something on a phone that had appeared from somewhere. He lowered it when she came in. "You should be lying down," she said. "You lost a great deal of blood." He looked at her steadily. "I've lost more," he said simply, and she believed him, which she found slightly disturbing. She adjusted his fore, checked the dressing, and was about to leave when he said, without any preamble, "How long have you worked here?" She paused. 6 years, she said. He nodded slowly, as if this told him something. "You like it?" She turned to look at him. It was a strange question, coming from a man in his condition, at 3 in the morning, in a room full of things nobody was naming. "Sometimes," she said honestly. "Tonight?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment. "Tongt is complicated," she said. And something shifted in his face, very briefly, not a smile exactly, but a small movement at the corner of his mouth that might have been one, once, a long time ago. At 3:17 in the morning, the corridor was finally quiet. Sophia came back to do a final check before handing off to the next nurse at shift change. She found him awake again, lying back this time, staring at the ceiling. The room was dim. The city was dark and quiet outside the window. Something about the hour made the walls thinner than usual, the way they sometimes got at that particular time of night when everyone's guard drops whether they wanted to or not. He asked her, without looking at her, why she became a nurse. She gave the short answer: it was a good profession, steady work, she was good with people. He waited. She knew he was waiting. She sighed quietly and gave the real answer: her younger brother, 7 years ago, a car accident, a very long night in a room much like this one, and a nurse who had stayed 2 hours past the end of her shift to sit with their mother so their mother would not have to sit alone. Marco was silent for a long time after that. Then he said, very quietly, "You're in the wrong city for someone like you." She asked him what that meant. He only looked at the ceiling. "Nothing," he said. "Go finish your shift." She left at 6 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to come up, pale and thin over the rooftops. She drove home, made tea she did not drink, and lay down on her bed still in her work clothes. She told herself she was tired. She told herself the night was over and she had done her job well and that was the end of it. She was asleep within 5 minutes. She slept without dreaming, which was unusual for her. When she returned the following morning, the room was empty. The bed was neatly made. The 4-stand stood beside it at a precise angle. The monitors were off. There was no sign that anyone had left quickly or been taken anywhere, only the clean, complete absence of the men who had been there. Sophia stood in the doorway for a moment, then went to check. On the small bedside table, folded once, was a blank piece of paper. She picked it up. Turned it over. Nothing on either side. She set it back down, then picked it up again and looked at it for another moment before placing it in the waste bin on her way out. She had patients to check on. She had a full shift ahead. She did not think about it again for the rest of the day. That was not entirely true. She thought about it 3 times. On the other side of the city, in a building on the waterfront that appeared on no public map, Marco Vitelli sat at a long table with 6 men. He had a fresh bandage on his left side, applied by someone who was not a nurse, and he was working through a list of problems that had begun the previous evening and required careful responses. He spoke for 20 minutes without stopping, giving instructions, making decisions, settling 2 matters that had been unsettled for longer than he liked. Then he stopped mid-sentence. The men at the table waited. One of them, Luca, who had served Marco for 11 years and had the good sense to say very little unless asked, watched his employer look at the middle distance for a moment with an expression Luca had never seen before and could not name. Marco said, "Find the nurse from the hospital last night. The one on the night shift." He paused. "Sophia." He said her name once, the way he said everything, quietly, with the certainty of a man who did not repeat himself. "Bring her to me." He looked back at the table. "Not to frighten her. Bring her politely." He picked up his pen and returned to his work as though nothing had changed. Luca exchanged the briefest look with the men beside him, then reached for his own phone. In 11 years he had learned that Marco's instructions, however unexpected, were always exactly what they appeared to be, and always considerably more complicated than they sounded. Sophia woke at 2 in the afternoon. She showered, made actual food this time, called her mother, and was sitting on her couch reading a book she could not concentrate on when someone knocked at her door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Unhurried. She set the book down and went to the door, looked through the peephole, and saw a man she had never seen before. He was standing back from the door slightly, hands visible at his sides, which she noted. He was well dressed and calm. When she did not open the door right away, he said, "Through it, Miss Reyes. I apologize for the interruption. A mutual acquaintance asked me to come. He would like to speak with you, if you're willing." She did not ask who. She already knew. She stood at the door for a long moment with her hand flat against the wood, thinking. Then she opened it. She was driven across the city in a black car with tinted windows. Nobody spoke. The driver took a route she did not fully recognize, and they arrived at a waterfront building that had no sign and a single door. Inside, it was quiet and clean, not cold, not threatening, just quiet. She was brought to a room on the upper floor. It had large windows that looked out over the harbor. The water was gray and flat in the afternoon light. She stood near the door for a moment, and then Marco came in from a side room. He looked entirely different from the men on the gurney. He was dressed properly now, dark jacket, no tie. He walked carefully, she could tell he was managing the pain in his side with the controlled movements of someone who refused to show weakness, but he was upright and fully present. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke, as if confirming something. Then he said, "I owe you a debt." Sophia looked back at him steadily. "You don't," she said. "I did my job." He shook his head once, slightly, as if she had missed the point. "Some debts exist whether the other person accepts them or not," he said. "I want you to be safe. I'm going to arrange that." She told him, with great clarity, that she did not need his arrangement. That she had taken care of herself for 28 years. That she had treated many patients and had not required protection from any of them afterward. He listened to all of this. He did not argue. He simply said, "I heard you," in a way that communicated that he had heard her and would also do exactly as he had decided. She felt the particular frustration of someone used to being listened to and not, in this case, being obeyed. She left. He did not stop her. For 3 days, nothing happened. She went to work. She treated her patients. She ate dinner and read her book and called her mother. The city was ordinary. On the 4th day, her colleague Rena mentioned, in passing, that the men from room 14, a patient who had said some things to Sophia 2 weeks ago that had made her walk home faster that evening, had apparently left the city quite suddenly. Nobody knew where. His apartment was empty. His things were gone. Rena thought it was strange. Sophia thought about it for a moment and then thought about something else. On the 5th day, there was an envelope in her mailbox. No stamp. No return address. Her name written on the front in neat, plain handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It said, "Your brother's remaining hospital balance has been settled in full. No further action is needed on your part. Do not argue about this." That last sentence, she thought, was the most revealing thing anyone had ever written to her. She sat down on the front step of her building in the early morning air with the note in her hand and stayed there for a long time. She was not sure what she was feeling. She was sure it was several things at once. Her brother's accident had happened 3 years ago. He had recovered, slowly and then steadily, and he was well now, working, living his life, making her mother proud in the way she had always hoped. But the bills from those first months had been real and heavy, and Sophia had been paying them down bit by bit for 2 years. She had never told anyone at work about it. She had never told any of her patients about it. She had told Marco about the nurse who had stayed with their mother. She had not said anything about money. He had found it anyway. Of course he had. She went back to the waterfront building that afternoon. She did not call ahead. She did not send a message through anyone. She simply drove across the city and walked up to the door and knocked, and after a moment it opened. She was brought upstairs without a word. She found Marco at the long table, alone this time, papers in front of him. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised, which irritated her slightly. She put the note on the table in front of him. She said, "I did not ask for this." He said, "I know." She said, "You had no right to go looking into my family's finances." He said, "No. I didn't." She stood there, waiting for him to justify it or argue about it, and he did neither. He simply looked at her and let the silence sit between them, and she realized, slowly, that he was not going to defend it because he had not done it to be right. He had done it because he wanted to. And he knew the difference. She asked him, after a pause, why. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, I have been very careful my entire life. About every person I allow close. About every decision I make. About what I show and what I don't. He looked at the window. The harbor was the same gray as before. That night, in the hospital, you were the only person in the room who looked at me and saw a patient. Not a problem. Not a powerful man. Not someone to be afraid of or useful to. Just a person who needed help. He stopped. I haven't been looked at that way in a very long time. Possibly ever. He looked back at her. So I was careless. I apologize for that. He did not look like someone who apologized often. He looked like someone who meant it. Sophia looked at him across the table. Outside, a ship moved slowly across the gray water. The room was quiet and warm. She thought about the night in the trauma bay, about the way his eyes had found her first when he woke. She thought about the note. She thought about the men from room 14 who had very suddenly decided to leave the city. She thought about her brother and her mother and the envelope in her mailbox and the way Marco had said her name in the dark of the hospital room, just once, quietly, as if he was committing it to memory. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. She placed her hands flat on the table. She looked at him directly and said, I have a lot of questions. He nodded once. You can ask them, he said. All of them. And the city moved outside the window, and the afternoon light lay quietly across the table between them, and Sofia Reyes, who had spent 6 years being the person who stayed when things were difficult, who had never once walked away from someone who needed her, decided, with full knowledge of what she was deciding, to stay in the room. End.